I still remember the exact weight of it in my hands. Not the turban itself, though after 50 years of wearing one, my hands knew every fold, every layer, every inch of that cloth better than I knew my own face. I mean the weight of what I was about to do. I was standing in my bathroom, alone, at 6:30 in the morning, and the white fabric was already unraveled in my hands, and I was staring at myself in the mirror. Really staring, the way you only do when something inside you has already changed, and your face just hasn't caught up yet. My hair, long and silver and never cut in my entire life, fell past my shoulders in a way it never had before, because I had never let it fall like that outside of this room, outside of this ritual of wrapping and securing and presenting myself to the world in the way I had been taught a man of faith presents himself. The steam from the shower was still in the air. I could smell the sandalwood soap my wife always bought, the same brand for 30 years, and the smell of it hit me differently that morning. Not like comfort, but like memory, like something that was about to become the past. And I stood there, holding 50 years of identity, 50 years of covenant, 50 years of the first thing I did every morning, and the last thing I undid every night. And I thought, Ravender, what are you doing? That morning changed everything. And I mean everything. Not just my appearance, not just the way people would look at me when I walked into a room, not just my family's reaction, though I'll get to that. And yes, it shocked me too, in ways I never could have predicted. I mean everything inside me. The foundations I thought were permanent. The convictions I thought could never move. The identity I had built so carefully, layer by layer. The way you wrap a daster, with precision and intention, and the belief that what you are building will hold. That morning, it all broke open. And what grew in the place where it broke, I am still learning how to describe it. I am still, at 68 years old, a man trying to find words for the most real thing that has ever happened to him. If this is your first time here, and something in what I am already saying is moving in you, would you consider subscribing to this channel and leaving a like before I go any further? It costs you nothing, and it helps more people find stories like this one. Stories that cost something to tell. I would be genuinely grateful. Now, let me take you back to where all of this began. My name is Ravender Singh. I was born in Amritsar, in the Punjab region of India, in 1957. The third of 5 children, 2 older sisters, myself, then my brother Kulwant, and then our youngest sister Harleen, who came 6 years after me and was spoiled by all of us in the way youngest children always are. My father was a deeply devout Sikh man. Not in a performative way. Not in the way some men wear religion like a suit they put on for Sundays and take off the moment they're back in their own house. He lived it. He breathed it. Every morning before the sun came up, I would hear him in the other room doing his nitnem, his daily prayers, his voice low and steady and rhythmic in the darkness. And that sound, that low, continuous, unhurried murmur of sacred words, was the sound of my childhood. It was the sound that meant the world was still in order. It was the first thing I heard most mornings, before I heard anything else, before the birds outside, before my sisters stirring in their room, before the distant sounds of the street waking up. The Gurbani filling our small house like incense smoke, rising and spreading into every corner until the whole house felt held by something invisible and strong. My father was not a complicated man in the way that people mean when they say that as a compliment. He was simple in the deepest sense. He knew what he believed. He lived what he believed. And he expected his children to do the same. He was not harsh about this. He was simply certain, and there is something about a father's certainty that becomes the ground beneath a child's feet before the child is old enough to question it. He tied my first turban when I was 7 years old. I remember standing very still while he worked. I had been told to stand still, and I was the kind of child who took instructions seriously. I remember the feeling of the cloth moving around my head, the slight pressure of each wrap, the smell of the starch my mother had pressed into the fabric the night before. My father's hands were rough, a farmer's hands, a man who worked with the earth. But so careful that morning, deliberate, like he was doing something sacred, because to him he was. He didn't speak much while he worked. He hummed a Shabbat's, a hymn, under his breath. When he was done, he turned me to face the small mirror on the wall, a mirror with a crack in the lower left corner that I had been staring at my whole young life, and he put both hands on my shoulders and looked at my reflection alongside mine. He said, "Now you are beginning to look like a man." I was 7 years old. I didn't fully understand what that meant, but I felt the pride in his voice, and I wanted to deserve it. I straightened my back. I lifted my chin slightly. I looked at the small boy in the mirror with the too large turban, and I thought, yes, this is right. This is who I am. That sense of rightness, of belonging, of being part of something that had existed long before me and would exist long after me, that sense was the atmosphere I grew up breathing. It was not something I chose. It was something I was born into, and then, as I grew older, something I chose to confirm. And there is a difference between those two things, even if for most of my life I didn't think about that difference at all. We came to the United States in 1981. I was 24 years old. My uncle had already been in California for 6 years. He had a small business, a convenience store in Fresno, that he had built from almost nothing through the kind of relentless, cheerful stubbornness that characterized everything he did. And he sponsored us. My wife, Simran Preet, who everyone had always called Simran from the time she was a girl, and our daughter Parveen, who was barely 2 years old at the time and slept through most of the flight as though intercontinental travel was the most ordinary thing in the world. We landed in Los Angeles on a Tuesday in March, and I still remember stepping outside the airport into that California air. Dry and warm in a way that felt almost theatrical after the Punjab winters I had known, and carrying a smell I couldn't identify at first, something like dust and citrus and possibility, and I stood there on the sidewalk outside the terminal with our bags around my feet and Simran beside me holding Parveen against her shoulder. And I thought, this is a new world. This is a new chapter. Whatever comes next, it is going to be different. But we brought our old world with us. Of course we did. That is what people do, and it is right that they do it. You carry your language, your food, your prayers, your songs, your way of marking time and celebrating and mourning. You carry your dead with you into the new place, and your obligations, and your memories, and the voices of your parents telling you who you are supposed to be. Within 2 years, we were deeply embedded in the local Sikh community in Fresno, where we had settled after a year in Los Angeles proved too large and too expensive for a young family trying to find its footing. The Gurdwara became the center of our lives, not just spiritually, but socially, culturally, practically. It was where we celebrated births and mourned deaths. It was where we found babysitters and business connections and friends who would become family. It was where Parveen grew up knowing she was part of something, that she had a community that would catch her if she fell. Every Sunday morning we would go together, the 3 of us, and then later, when Simran's parents came to live with us in the early 90s, the 5 of us. Simran in her best dupatta, which was a deep burgundy silk that her mother had brought from India, and that Simran wore only for the Gurdwara and for weddings. Parveen beside her, first as a small child and then as a teenager, and then as a young woman who had her own opinions about everything, but who still came every Sunday without complaint. And me in my freshly tied duster, on regular Sundays the deep blue one, on high occasions the white one that my father had given me before we left India, the one I kept wrapped in a cloth in the back of the closet and treated with a care that bordered on reverence. Because my father had always said that when you come before the Guru Granth Sahib, you come in your best, you come prepared, you come as someone who understands the weight of what they are entering into. I loved that life. I need to say that clearly, because I think sometimes people tell conversion stories as though everything before was ash and shadow, as though they were miserable every moment and couldn't wait to escape. That is not honest, and I am committed to honesty above almost everything else. I loved my faith. I loved the community of it. I loved the langar, the community kitchen, the free meals served to anyone who walked through the doors, the radical equality of it. Everyone sitting on the floor together, regardless of who they were or what they had outside those walls, eating the same food, being the same in that space. I loved the music of the kirtan, the sound of the harmonium, and the tabla weaving together in the prayer hall. The melodies that seemed to slow time down, that seemed to say, there is no hurry. There is only this. I loved the smell of the langar kitchen on Sunday mornings, the dal and the sabzi and the fresh rotis, the warmth of it, the way it felt like being fed in more ways than one. I loved the sense of belonging, the sense that I was part of something ancient and dignified and good, something that stretched back centuries and had survived persecution and diaspora and loss and was still here, still singing, still feeding the hungry, still wrapping cloth around the heads of 7-year-old boys and saying, "Now you are beginning to look like a man." I served as a Granthi for 11 years. For those who don't know, a Granthi is a reader and interpreter of the Guru Granth Sahib, the sacred scripture of Sikhism, which is understood not merely as a book, but as the living presence of the Guru. I led prayers. I performed ceremonies. I recited from the scripture at weddings and funerals, and naming ceremonies for newborns, the Akhand Path, the continuous reading that goes on for 48 hours, without stopping at times of great significance. I was trusted with the most sacred moments in people's lives. Families called me when they were welcoming a new child into the world, and when they were releasing someone from it. I held that responsibility with everything I had. I prepared carefully. I prayed before every ceremony. I took it seriously in the way my father had taken everything seriously, not grimly, but deeply, with the understanding that some things deserve your whole self. My turban was not clothing to me. I have to keep coming back to this because it is so central to what happened later, and I don't want you to misunderstand the magnitude of it. In Sikhism, the dastar is a crown. It is a symbol of sovereignty, of honor, of commitment to the Khalsa, the community of the initiated, those who have taken the Amrit, the initiation ceremony, and committed themselves to a specific way of living. When I walked into a room wearing my turban, I was making a declaration without speaking a word. I am a Sikh. I have made promises. I belong to something larger than myself. I take that belonging seriously enough to mark it on my body every single day. For 50 years, I never left my house without it. Not when I was sick with a fever so high that Simran made me stay in bed and brought soup to the room. Not when I was so exhausted I could barely stand. Not on the worst days of my life. Not on the days I would rather have disappeared. The turban was always there, always the first thing I put on in the morning, always the last thing I removed at night. It was, in a very real sense, the most consistent thing about me. So when I tell you what happened, what slowly, quietly, unavoidably happened to me, I need you to hold that in your mind. The scale of what I was carrying, the scale of what changed. It started small. It always does, I think. The things that end up reordering your whole life rarely announce themselves with trumpets. They come quietly, through a side door you didn't even know was there. My neighbor Thomas had lived 3 houses down from us for about 4 years before any of this began. He was a black man in his early 60s, retired from the post office, a grandfather 3 times over, with a laugh that you could hear from down the street, and a gentleness about him that you felt immediately. We had talked many times over those 4 years, about his grandchildren, about the almond trees in his backyard that he was inordinately proud of, about the neighborhood, about the construction on the main road that seemed to go on for 2 years longer than anyone thought possible. He was one of those people who makes a neighborhood feel like a neighborhood rather than just a collection of houses with doors that stay closed. I liked him. I respected him. But we were neighbors, not close friends. One Saturday morning in October, I believe it was about 7 years ago now, though time moves strangely when you're looking back at something this significant, I was returning from my morning walk. I walked every morning, the same route, about 4.5 miles, always in my turban, always before breakfast. Thomas was on his porch with his coffee, as he often was on Saturday mornings. And beside him on the porch railing was a Bible, open, its pages slightly lifting in the morning breeze. He called to me, "Ravender, you got a minute?" I walked over. I leaned against the porch railing. The morning air was cool and carried the smell of his coffee. Dark roast, strong, the kind of smell that is more of a presence than a scent. He said, "I've been reading something this morning that made me think of you. I don't know exactly why, but I feel like I'm supposed to share it with you." I smiled the way you smile when you are not entirely sure what's coming, but you want to be courteous. He looked down at his Bible, found the place with his finger, and read to me from the Gospel of John, chapter 14. He read slowly, in the unhurried way he approached everything. "I am the way, and the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." He looked up. "What do you think about that?" he asked. I gave him the answer I always gave in those situations. I said it was a beautiful passage. I said that all the great spiritual traditions of the world speak of the divine in their own way, each finding a language for what cannot ultimately be put into words. I said that in Sikhism, we believe the light of God, what we call Waheguru, dwells in every human being, and that this light is the same light that all sincere seekers are reaching toward. I was gracious. I was measured. I had had interfaith conversations before, many of them, in fact, because as a Granthi, people often came to me with theological questions, and I prided myself on being the kind of religious leader who could speak respectfully and intelligently about traditions not his own. I said what I always said, and then I smiled, and I told Thomas I would let him get back to his reading, and I walked home. But the words didn't leave. This is the part that still surprises me when I think about it, because I am not a man who is easily unsettled. I have a deliberate mind. I have always been careful about what I let take root in me. But those words, "I am the way, and the truth, and the life," they did not behave the way I expected them to. They did not fade after a few hours or a few days. They rose to the surface of my thinking at the strangest moments. While I was in the car, the radio on, ordinary Tuesday afternoon, stopped at a red light. Those words. While I was eating breakfast, the sound of Simran in the kitchen, the smell of cardamom in the chai, those words. While I was at the Gurdwara, in the middle of leading prayers, the Gurbani flowing through me as it had for decades, my voice carrying the sacred words with the confidence of long practice, and underneath that confidence, or beside it, or woven through it in a way I couldn't locate, those words, I am the way. That last situation, the words surfacing while I was leading prayers, disturbed me more than any of the others. It felt like a betrayal of the scripture I was reciting, of the community around me, of my father's memory. I would push the thought away and refocus and continue, and for a while it would be fine, and then it would surface again. Not loudly, not aggressively, just present, persistent. The way a small light in a dark room is impossible to ignore, even if you're trying to look somewhere else. I didn't tell Simran. I couldn't imagine how to begin. What would I say? A Bible verse is following me around? I was a Granthi. I was a respected member of a community that trusted me to guide them spiritually. I was the man people called when they needed someone to know what to say at the most important moments of their lives. You don't tell that man's wife that a neighbor read him a verse from the New Testament, and it hasn't left his mind since. So I started reading. Quietly, carefully, in a way that felt, at the time, almost furtive, and that I now understand was simply the beginning of something I wasn't yet ready to own in front of other people. I bought a Bible from a bookstore on a weekday afternoon. I timed it for when I knew no one from my community was likely to be in that part of town. I stood in the religion section for longer than I should have, looking at the different translations, feeling strangely exposed, as though everyone around me could see exactly what I was doing and why. I chose a translation with a plain cover, nothing that announced itself. I paid cash. I brought it home and put it in my car, in the pocket behind the passenger seat, and I would take it out during my lunch break and read in whatever parking lot I happened to be in. The bright, flat parking lot of the office park, where I worked at the time, or the shaded lot behind the supermarket, or the quiet side street near the Gurdwara that felt almost ironic as a reading spot, though I didn't let myself think about that too much. I started with the Gospel of John, because that was where Thomas had been reading. I want to tell you what I expected to find, because I think it matters. I expected to encounter a tradition that felt foreign to everything I knew. I expected the exclusivity of that verse, "No one comes to the Father except through me," to feel like a wall, a boundary marker, a sign that said certain people were welcome and others were not. I had encountered that version of Christianity before, and it had always confirmed my sense that this was not a tradition I had any reason to explore further. Instead, I found something I did not expect at all. I found a man who touched lepers, a man who stopped a crowd from stoning a woman, and then, instead of lecturing her, simply said, "Go, and sin no more." A man who spoke directly to women in public spaces when his entire culture said he shouldn't. A man who sat down with tax collectors and ate with them, not after they had reformed themselves, but while they were still what they were. A man who noticed a woman who had been bleeding for 12 years and had spent everything she had trying to get better and had only gotten worse. He noticed her in the middle of a crowd, and he stopped, and he turned, and he said, "Daughter, your faith has healed you, daughter." To a woman who had been ritually unclean for 12 years and had probably not been touched with gentleness in longer than she could remember. I kept stopping, putting the Bible down on the passenger seat, looking out the windshield at whatever parking lot I happened to be in, thinking about what I had just read. I found Jesus. Not the theological proposition, not the cultural symbol, not the figure on signs and billboards. I mean, I found a person, a presence on those pages that was unlike anything I had encountered in my years of reading sacred texts, and I had read a great deal, and I knew the difference between words about the divine and words that somehow carried something alive inside them. There was a reality to these accounts that I couldn't dismiss, and I tried to dismiss it, because it would have been so much easier if I could. I tried to read it as mythology, as metaphor, as beautiful human storytelling about timeless spiritual truths, and I could not make it stay in those categories. It kept insisting on itself as something more. I read the Sermon on the Mount on a Wednesday afternoon in the parking lot of a hardware store, and when I was done, I sat very still for a long time, with my hands in my lap, and the afternoon sun warm on my face through the windshield, and I thought, either this man is the truest thing I have ever read, or he is the greatest lie ever told. There is no comfortable middle ground here. That was the thing I couldn't escape. Jesus himself doesn't leave you room for a comfortable middle ground. He doesn't present himself as one wise teacher among many, one path among several equally valid options. He says, I am the truth. Not a truth. The truth. And you have to decide what to do with that. I want to pause here for a moment and ask you something, because I'm thinking about the person on the other side of this screen right now. Where are you watching this from? What city? What country? There is something I kept feeling during those parking lot afternoons. This acute awareness that I was not the only person in the world sitting somewhere with a question I didn't know how to ask out loud. Something tugging at me from a direction I wasn't prepared to look. If that is you right now, if something in you is leaning toward something you haven't named yet, I want you to know that you are not as alone as you might feel. Leave a comment. Tell me where you are. I read them. I think about the people behind them. Those parking lot afternoons went on for months, and then for more months. I was doing my Sikh prayers every morning, still tying my turban, still going to the Gurdwara, still performing my duties as a Granthi with the care and commitment I had always brought to them. And I was also, in the hidden part of my life, reading the Gospels, and then the letters of Paul, and then the book of Acts, and then, eventually, back to the beginning of the whole thing, sitting with the strangeness and the weight of it. And I was praying, not abandoning my Sikh prayers, but adding to them something I had no framework for, a direct address to the person I was reading about, saying, internally, in the privacy of my own mind, Jesus, if you are who you say you are, then you already know I'm doing this. And if you're real, you know I'm looking for you. Show me something true. I was not asking for a miracle. I am a rational man. I spent 11 years working with sacred texts, which teaches you a great deal about the difference between genuine encounter and wishful projection. I wasn't asking to be convinced by something spectacular. I was asking for clarity, for the kind of truth that doesn't need spectacle to sustain itself. Clarity came eventually, but it came through my brother's heart, and a hospital room, and 2 words in a book I had been reading in parking lots for the better part of 2 years. Kulwant had a heart attack in January, 6 years ago now. He was 61 years old and had always been the physically largest of us, the loudest, the one who dominated a room without meaning to, who laughed from his whole chest and ate with great enthusiasm and seemed, fundamentally, like someone the world would struggle to hold. He lived in Sacramento, about a 2.5-hour drive north of Fresno. His wife called me the evening it happened, and I drove up the next morning. The morning was cold and gray, the Central Valley flat and pale on either side of the highway, and I drove with the radio off for most of it, just the sound of the engine and my own thoughts. When I walked into the hospital room, Kulwant was in the bed, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. The monitors beeped in a steady, patient rhythm. There was the smell of antiseptic, and below that, something more human, something that hospitals try to cover and never quite do. He was pale. The sheet was pulled up to his chest. There were tubes. His hands, resting at his sides, looked unfamiliar without their usual animation, without the gestures he had always used to punctuate everything he said. His wife had stepped out to get tea. We were alone for a while. He looked at me with tired eyes, eyes that had been looking at something no one else in the room had seen. And he said, "Ravender, I thought I was going to die. I was on the kitchen floor and I thought, this is it. This is the end." He paused, gathering himself. And I was scared. He said it plainly, the way you can only say something plainly when you have been too close to the edge for pretense. All those years of prayers, all those years of believing I knew what came next. And when I was actually facing it, I was just scared, like a child. We sat with that for a moment. The monitor beeped. Somewhere in the hallway, footsteps passed and receded. I asked him, in that moment, on the floor, "What did you want? What were you reaching for?" He thought about it with the seriousness the question deserved. Then he said, "I wanted someone to be with me. Not just anyone. Someone who had already been through it. Someone who knew what was on the other side and had come back." He looked at me. "Is there such a person, Ravender? Does our faith give us that?" I didn't answer him immediately. I couldn't, because the answer that rose in me was not from the tradition we had shared our whole lives. I drove home from Sacramento that evening in the gathering dark, Kulwant's words sitting in my chest with a specific gravity. Someone who had already been through it. Someone who knew what was on the other side. The highway lights came on one by one as the sky went from gray to deep blue to black. I thought about a tomb in Jerusalem. I thought about a man who had gone into death and come out the other side. I thought about the verse I had first read in Thomas's yard. "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, even though he dies, yet shall he live." I got home at almost 11 at night. Simran was already asleep, her breathing even and slow in the dark bedroom. I went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water and stood at the counter in the dark, the refrigerator humming its low, steady note, the street outside quiet. And something in me, the resistance, the careful distance I had been maintaining, finally let go. Not dramatically, not with any outward sign, just quietly, in the dark, in my own kitchen, with a glass of water in my hand, something released. I went to my car. I got the Bible from behind the passenger seat. I came back inside and sat at the kitchen table and turned on the small light above the table. The warm yellow light that Simran had always called the good light. The one that made the kitchen feel like the inside of something safe. And I opened to the Gospel of John, chapter 11. The story of Lazarus. I had read it before several times, but I read it again that night, slowly, not rushing past anything. Lazarus has been dead for 4 days when Jesus arrives. The sisters meet him, first Martha, then Mary. Mary falls at his feet and says, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." She is weeping. The people with her are weeping. And then, this is the part, then Jesus, who John has already told us is the Son of God, who will in moments perform the greatest miracle any of them have ever witnessed, who knows exactly what is about to happen. Jesus sees them weeping. He is troubled in his spirit. He weeps. 2 words, Jesus wept. I sat at that kitchen table, and those two words hit me the way simple things sometimes hit you. Not with immediate force, but with a slow, spreading weight, like water soaking through cloth. The Son of God standing at a grave and weeping, not explaining death away, not offering the correct theological framework for processing loss, not maintaining divine composure in the face of human grief, just being there, entering into it, feeling it with them because he loved them, because Lazarus was his friend, and these women were his friends, and their pain was real, and he let it be real to him. Kulwant on the kitchen floor, wanting someone who had already been through it. I put my hands flat on the cool surface of the table. I bowed my head, and I said, out loud, in a voice barely above a whisper in the quiet kitchen, Jesus, I believe you are who you say you are. I don't have everything figured out. I don't know exactly what this means for my life, for my family, for everything I have built, but I believe you. You are the way. You are the truth. You are the life. Please, be with me. Please don't let me do this without you. The refrigerator hummed. The kitchen was still. The street outside was as quiet as it ever gets at 11 at night, in a house in a neighborhood in a city that is always somewhere between sleeping and waking. Nothing around me changed at all, but something in me settled in a way it had never settled before in my life. Like a compass that had been spinning for decades, or maybe my whole life, though I hadn't fully understood it as spinning, had thought the movement was normal. Suddenly finding north. I cannot prove that to you. I would not try to. I can only tell you that it was the most real thing I have ever experienced, and that the restlessness I had not even fully recognized as restlessness, until it stopped. It stopped. I sat at that table for a long time. I didn't know what came next. I only knew that something had irrevocably begun. What came next was not easy. I want to say that plainly because I think there is a version of these stories that makes conversion sound like a door you walk through into a room full of light, with all your problems solved and everyone around you happy for you. That is not what happened. What happened was that I walked through a door into truth, and truth, as it turns out, requires you to live it out in the specific, complicated, painful texture of your actual life. And my actual life was full of people I loved. People whose love for me was woven together with a shared identity that I was about to unravel. I told Thomas first. I drove to his house on a Saturday morning, exactly 1 year, almost to the day, since he had read that verse to me on his porch. The morning was cool, the light thin and pale, the almond trees in his yard bare. He came to the door in his robe and with his coffee and took one look at my face. He said, "Come sit down." We sat on his porch and I told him everything, all of it, the parking lots and the months of reading and my brother's heart attack and the kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night. I spoke for a long time without him interrupting, which was exactly what I needed. And when I finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking out at the street. Then he set his coffee mug down on the railing and turned to me and said, "Ravender, I have been praying for you every single week since that Saturday morning. Every week. I didn't know what God was doing. I just knew he was doing something." His eyes were wet. Mine were too. He reached over and gripped my shoulder with one large hand and said, "Welcome, brother." I did not cry easily. I had not cried in front of another person in many years. I cried then, not loudly, not dramatically, just a few tears that I let come without trying to stop them, which was itself a kind of freedom. Telling Simran was the hardest thing I had done in 46 years of marriage. I agonized over how and when for weeks. We had built everything together, she and I. The immigration, the years of scraping and saving and building a life in a country that did not always make it easy to be who we were. The raising of Parveen, the grief when we lost her parents, the rhythms and rituals and small daily intimacies of 4 decades spent beside the same person. She knew me better than anyone on earth, and she was deeply, beautifully committed to her Sikh faith. Not as an obligation, but as a love. It was genuinely hers. It had carried her through difficult things. I knew that what I was about to tell her would shake her in a way that nothing else in our marriage had. I told her on a Sunday evening. We had eaten dinner. She had made dal makhani, and the kitchen still held the smell of the cumin and tomatoes and cream. The smell that meant home to me more than almost anything. And we were sitting at the table with our chai, and the house was quiet in the way it was quiet on Sunday evenings. Parveen long grown and gone, just the two of us in the good yellow light. I said, "Simran, I need to tell you something that is going to be hard to hear." She set her cup down. She looked at my face, and she did what she always did. She read it. After 46 years, my face was not a mystery to her. She said, very quietly, "How long?" "Almost 3 years," I said. She was silent. She got up from the table and walked to the kitchen window and stood looking out at the backyard, her arms folded across her chest, her back to me. I waited. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, the neighbor's dog barked once and was quiet. Finally, she turned around and her face was composed. Simran has always been able to hold herself together in the face of things that are breaking her, but her eyes were bright and wet. She said, "What does this mean for us, Ravinder? For our family? For everything we are?" I said, "I love you. I am not leaving you. I am not leaving our family. But I cannot pretend that I don't believe what I believe. I have tried to find a way around this, and there is no way around it. This is true. I know it is true. And I cannot live dishonestly." She left the kitchen. She didn't slam a door. She didn't raise her voice. She simply withdrew, the way water withdraws, quietly, completely, leaving the space empty. And that silence was heavier than any argument would have been, because it was the silence of someone who loves you choosing to hold their pain privately rather than put it on you. And that kind of love is its own kind of sorrow. The weeks that followed were the most tender and difficult of my marriage. We moved through the house carefully, kindly, with a deliberateness that was new and strange. We were not cold to each other. We were almost too careful, like two people carrying something fragile between them, aware that any sudden movement could break it. Simran grieved. I understood that grief, and I did not try to argue her out of it or rush her through it. She was losing something. Not me, not our marriage, not our life together, but the shared identity we had always assumed we would carry to the end. The assumption that we would walk out of this world the way we had walked through it, side by side, under the same spiritual shelter. That assumption was gone now, and its absence left a cold space that neither of us knew how to fill. I told our daughter Parveen on a weekday afternoon by phone. She was 47, living in San Jose with her husband Deepak and our 3 grandchildren. I told her as simply and directly as I could, because Parveen had always responded better to directness than to anything she might perceive as evasion. There was a long silence when I finished. Then she said, "Dad, are you okay? Are you going through something? Do you need to talk to someone? Like a professional?" She thought it was a breakdown. She thought grief or age or some unnamed crisis had loosened something in me, I said, "Parveen, I have never been more clear about anything in my life. I am not in crisis. I found something true, and I am telling you because you deserve to know." She said she needed to think, and she hung up. And for a while after that, the calls between us were shorter and less frequent, and the distance in her voice when we did speak was something I felt in my chest every time. I prayed for her constantly. I did not push. I did not send her scriptures or forward her articles, or in any way attempt to argue her into something she wasn't ready for. Jesus never chased anyone down. He stood. He invited. He waited. That was the example I was trying to follow, imperfectly and humbly, because patience has never come as naturally to me as I would like. I found a church during this time, a diverse congregation in central Fresno, mostly Latino and Black families, with a worship band that played with a joy that was almost physical, something you could feel in your chest when you walked through the door. The pastor was a man named Marcus, who had grown up in Compton, had a story of transformation that made mine look straightforward, and who had a way of preaching that made ancient things feel as close as the chair you were sitting in. I started attending quietly, sitting in the back row, still in my turban, not ready to make anything official, just being there, receiving, listening. Pastor Marcus welcomed me with a handshake my second Sunday, and no questions whatsoever. He said, "Good to have you," and moved on. The congregation around me was warm in the specific way that communities who have known hardship tend to be warm, genuine, unbothered by complexity, rooted in something that didn't need you to be uncomplicated before it would accept you. I felt, for the first time in a long time, simply welcome. I met with Pastor Marcus in his office after I had been attending for about 4 months. His office smelled of coffee. He always had a pot going, and was lined floor to ceiling with books in the comfortable, haphazard way of someone who actually reads all of them. There was a plain wooden cross on the wall behind his desk. I told him about my background, about the turban, about Simran, about everything. He listened the way Thomas listened, without hurrying me, without inserting himself, just fully present. When I was done, he sat back in his chair and said, "What does the turban mean to you now, Ravender? Not what it meant when you were 7 years old? Not what it meant for the last 50 years? What does it mean to you today?" I thought about that for a long time, long enough that the coffee machine made a sound, and he got up and refilled his cup without breaking the silence. Finally, I said, "It is a declaration of loyalty, of belonging, and I'm not sure anymore that the loyalty it declares and the belonging it claims are where my loyalty and my belonging actually are." He nodded slowly, looking at his coffee. "That's between you and God," he said, "but it sounds to me like you already know." I knew. The morning in the bathroom, the sandalwood soap, the mirror, the silver hair falling loose for the first time in my life. That was a Tuesday in March, almost 3 years ago now. I had been praying about it for months, not asking for permission exactly, but seeking clarity, seeking the honesty to do what I already knew needed to be done, and the courage to do it, knowing what it would cost. That Tuesday morning, I woke before Simran, before the sun was fully up, and I went to the bathroom and I closed the door and I stood at the mirror and I unwrapped my turban for the last time. I stood there looking at myself for a long time, at my silver hair, at my face, which was older than I always expected it to be when I looked in the mirror, because in my mind I was still somewhere in my 40s, and the face looking back at me was 65. I thought about my father's hands, about that small, cracked mirror in Amritsar, about the boy who straightened his back and lifted his chin and thought, "This is right. This is who I am. About 50 years of mornings, 50 years of the smell of starch and the ritual of wrapping, 50 years of walking into every room of my life with that crown on my head. I prayed. I said, Father, I offer this, not as a statement, not for anyone else to see, as honesty, as the truest thing I know how to do right now. I left the bathroom. Simran was awake when I came back into the bedroom. She saw me in the doorway. Her hand went to her mouth. Her eyes filled immediately, completely, without any preliminary. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. We stood on either side of the bed and looked at each other. Then she said, in Punjabi, the language of our childhood, the language that holds things English cannot hold, Ravinder, what have you done? I sat down on the edge of the bed. I reached out and took her hand. I said, I have done the most honest thing I know how to do. She cried. I held her while she cried, and I felt the full weight of what I was asking her to carry. And I did not try to make it lighter than it was. I had learned by then that trying to make grief lighter before it has been fully felt is not kindness. It is impatience, dressed as kindness. So I held her, and I let it be what it was. Now, the family's response. Because I promised you, I would get there, and I know it is part of why you're still watching. I expected rejection. I want to be completely transparent about that. I had prepared myself for it. I had thought through the worst versions of what might happen, had held them in my mind and tried to make my peace with them in advance. I expected to be treated as someone who had dishonored his family, who had turned his back on everything his father had stood for, who had betrayed the community that had welcomed him and trusted him and given him their most important moments to hold. That would have been understandable. In many families, in many communities, it would have been not only understandable, but inevitable. My brother Kulwant called me the same day word got out, and word always gets out quickly in a Punjabi family. The information moved faster than I could have managed it, even if I had been trying to. I answered his call and I braced myself. He said, I heard what you did, Ravinder. A pause. I've been thinking about what I said to you in the hospital, about wanting someone who had already been through it, someone who knew what was on the other side. His voice was careful, deliberate, in the way of a man who is working something out while he speaks. I think I need to hear more about this Jesus. I could not speak for a moment. I pressed the phone against my ear and stood in the middle of my kitchen and felt something move through me that I still don't fully have words for. When I found my voice, I said, Kulwant, are you serious right now? He said, Ravinder, when have I ever not been serious when it mattered? He was not joking. Over the months that followed, my brother and I had more genuine, deep, searching conversations than we had had in the previous 30 years combined. He drove down to Fresno. He came to church with me, sat beside me in that back row with his arms folded across his big chest and his eyes serious, listening to Pastor Marcus with an attention I recognized because I had seen it in the mirror. He was not ready to make any decision. He said that clearly, and I respected it. But he was asking. He was genuinely, honestly asking. And asking is everything. Asking is the beginning of everything. Parveen's response came slower and harder, and was slower still to resolve. She was angry for a long time. Not explosive, not cutting, but quietly, consistently, protectively angry in the way people are angry when someone they love has changed the terms of a relationship without their consent. She called less often. When we did speak, there was a careful quality to her voice. like someone walking over ground they're not sure will hold them. It hurt. It hurt in the specific way that distance from a child always hurts a parent. This awareness that the closeness you took for granted is no longer something you can assume. I prayed for her. I loved her from the distance she needed to put between us. I trusted that God, who had been more patient with me than I deserved, could be patient with her too. About 14 months after the morning in the bathroom, Parveen came to Fresno for a visit with her family. It was a Sunday, and we had eaten together. Simran had cooked, as she always did when Parveen came. The full effort, the kitchen smelling of everything I loved, and the house warm and full in the way it only is when family is in it. After dinner, while the older grandchildren were in front of the television and Simran was in the kitchen, my grandson Arjun, 9 years old, small and precise and constitutionally incapable of letting a question go unasked, looked at me across the dinner table with those serious eyes of his and said, "Grandpa, why don't you wear your turban anymore?" The table went quiet. Parveen's eyes moved to me. Her husband, Deepak, looked at his plate. I looked at my grandson and I said, "Because I found something true, Arjun, and I wanted to be honest about it." He considered this for approximately 3 seconds. Then he said, "Okay, can I have more rice?" The table laughed. All of us, even Parveen. The kind of laugh that breaks through something that has been tight for too long. And in that laughter, something shifted. Parveen and I talked that night after everyone else was asleep. We sat at the kitchen table, that kitchen table that has held more of my important moments than any other piece of furniture I have ever owned. And she said, "Dad, I don't understand your faith. I don't think I'm supposed to, not yet. But I can see that you are different. You are calmer than I've ever known you to be. There is something in you that wasn't there before, and I don't know what to do with it." I said, "You don't have to do anything with it right now. Just let it be what it is. Let me be your father. Let me love you the way I have always loved you." She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over mine and said, "I love you, Dad." I said, "I love you too, Parveen. That has never changed, and it never will." The Gurdwara community, my community of 30-plus years, that loss was its own kind of grief. There were people who had known me since our earliest years in Fresno, whose children I had blessed, whose parents I had helped to bury, people I had sat beside at Langer hundreds of times, people whose phone numbers I knew by memory, and who knew mine. Some of them stopped speaking to me entirely. One man I had genuinely considered a close friend sent word through a mutual acquaintance that I had brought shame to everything I had ever claimed to stand for. That found its mark. I won't pretend otherwise. There were nights when I lay in the dark with that accusation and felt its weight fully, not trying to push it away, asking God whether it was true, asking Him to show me where I had gone wrong if I had gone wrong. And what came back, quietly, consistently, was not condemnation. It was the knowledge that following truth always costs something, and that the cost of following it is not the same as the cost of being wrong. Simran. Her story is still unfolding, and I want to be honest about that because I think sometimes people want these things to have tidy endings, and her story does not have a tidy ending yet. She still practices her faith. She still does her morning prayers in the language we have both known since childhood. She still goes to the Gurdwara, and I do not ask her not to, and I would not, because her faith is genuinely hers, and I love her for it, even as I can no longer share it in the same way. What I try to do is love her in a way that makes the Jesus I follow visible, not by preaching, not by argument, by being the husband I am called to be, with more patience and more grace than I could manufacture on my own. There was an evening, not long ago, when she found me at the kitchen table reading my Bible in the good yellow light. It was late. The house was quiet. She came in for a glass of water, and she stood there for a moment looking at me. And then, instead of going back to bed, she sat down across from me. She said, "Read me something." I looked at her. I said, "What do you want to hear?" She said, "Something gentle." I read her the 23rd Psalm. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." I read it slowly, in a quiet voice, as though the words deserved to settle. Her eyes were closed when I looked up. When I finished, she was still for a moment. Then she said, softly, "That is beautiful." And she got up and went back to bed. I sat there for a long time after that. The house was still. The street was still. And I felt, more completely than I know how to express, the patience of God. The way He works without urgency and without coercion. The way He reaches people through beauty and gentleness and the sound of familiar words in a kitchen at midnight. I don't know where Simran is in her own journey. That is between her and God. But I have learned not to confuse not knowing with there being nothing happening. My brother Kulwant gave his life to Jesus 8 months ago. He called me on a Sunday afternoon, a day I was sitting in the backyard in the autumn warmth, the light coming through the leaves, the smell of the almond trees that I have come to love the way Thomas taught me to love them. His voice, when I answered, was different, quieter and fuller at the same time, the way a voice sounds when something has settled into it. He said, "Ravinder, I prayed this morning." I told him yes. I stood up from my chair. I pressed the phone to my ear. And I started crying before I had any words at all. He started crying too. 2 old Punjabi men, 67 and 68 years old, on the phone across 200 miles of California Valley, both of them crying in their respective backyards. And it was the least dignified and most sacred thing I have known in a very long time. My granddaughter Divya, Parveen's oldest, 12 years old, serious and quiet and precise in the way that some children simply are, asked me last Christmas what I believe. We were sitting by the window, and the light outside was pale and still, the kind of winter light that makes everything feel like it's holding its breath. She looked at me directly and said, "Grandpa, what do you actually believe? Not what you used to believe. What do you believe now?" And I told her, as simply as I could, about a man who lived and taught and died, and on the 3rd day was alive again, and who is alive right now, and who loves her with a love that does not require her to earn it, or deserve it, or understand it before she can receive it. She listened to every word. Then she said, "How do you know it's true?" I said, "Because I talked to him." And he answered. Not in the way I expected, but he answered. She sat with that for a while. The curtains shifted slightly in a draft from somewhere. Finally, she leaned her head against my shoulder, this 12-year-old granddaughter of mine, and she said nothing more, and I said nothing more, and we just sat there together in the pale light. I am 68 years old. I have more life behind me than ahead of me, in all statistical probability, and I have made peace with that in a way I could not have made peace with it before. Before Jesus, death was a theological proposition I managed with religious language. Now it is a doorway. I know who built it, and I know who has already gone through it and come back, and so I am no longer afraid of it in the way that I was afraid of it when I would not let myself name the fear. I think of my father, who did his nitnem every morning in the dark, and whose hands were so careful on the day he tied my first turban. I think of him, and I trust that God, who is both more just and more merciful than any of us can fully imagine, is not less good than we hope. He is the way. I say that not as a slogan, not as a religious position I have adopted to replace the previous one, but as the most honest report I know how to give. I was a man who sought truth for his entire adult life, who immersed himself in sacred texts and led others in prayer and tried to do what was right. And I am telling you what I found at the end of that long seeking. I found a person, the most real person I have ever encountered. A man who wept at a grave before he opened it, who touched the untouchable, who said to a woman who had been sick for 12 years, "Daughter," who said to fishermen and tax collectors, "Follow me," who went into death and came out the other side and said to people who were standing there trying to figure out what was real, "Do not be afraid. You can talk to him." Wherever you are right now, in a car, in a kitchen, in a hospital waiting room, in a parking lot with a book you're almost embarrassed to be reading, you can say his name. You can say, "I don't understand this. I don't have this figured out. I'm not sure what I believe." But if you are real, then you already know I'm saying this. He will hear you. I believe he has been hearing you longer than you know. I believe he has been more patient with you than you have any framework for yet. And I believe that if you give him the chance, really give him the chance, not as an experiment, not to see if it works, but with the genuine openness that a person brings to something that might actually be true, he will not disappoint you. Ravinder Singh is 68 years old. He is still married to the woman he has loved for 46 years. He still lives in Fresno, still sits in the back row of a church, where the worship is joyful and loud, and the pastor grew up in Compton, and knows what transformation actually costs. He no longer wears a turban. His hair is shorter than it has been since before he can remember, and he has never, in 68 years of living, been more fully himself than he is right now. If this story reached you, if something in what Ravinder Singh told you today moved even a small thing inside you, would you subscribe to this channel before you go? This is a place where people tell the truth about what it cost them to find truth. Real stories, real people, real encounters with the living Jesus. Every subscriber helps another person find their way here. Maybe someone who is sitting in their own parking lot right now. Maybe someone who has been wearing something for 50 years and is beginning to wonder what it means. Maybe someone who just needs to hear that they are not as alone as they feel. Subscribe. Share this with someone who is searching. And if you are that person, if you are the one who is searching, keep going. Keep asking. The one you are looking for has been looking for you. His name is Jesus, and he is worth every single thing it costs to find him.